the world!
The last in-person Tule Lake Pilgrimage in 2018 was a wonderful gathering of Japanese American pilgrims who rallied and protested against detaining children at the southern border, demanding that our government stop repeating history.
For being Japanese Americans! And for resisting their incarceration!
The rally happened in front of the notorious Tule Lake Jail and Stockade, the Guantanamo of World War II, where dissident Japanese Americans were singled out for punishment and deportation for the crime of protesting their unjust incarceration.
We are outraged that children are being incarcerated. In U.S.
Hundreds of Tule Lake survivors and descendants participated in the nationwide Day of Resistance, joining hundreds of thousands of immigration activists across the nation who oppose child and family detention. How fitting that protest was the genesis of an anti-racist, progressive Japanese American activist organization, Suru for Solidarity, that has emerged as an important Japanese American voice to protest immigrant detention and to support Black reparations.
One of the times I went back, they were actually having a protest demonstration at the Dilley Family Residential Center. And most of the protesters were immigration rights groups that had been organizing, family members. And I was the only Japanese American there. But they asked me to speak because they had known I had been inside and talked to the families. So when I got up to speak, I said, without really realizing the connection for myself, I said, you know, not far from here is Crystal City, Texas, where my brother and I were children separated from our father, were held for indefinite detention to be deported to Japan. And so what we're seeing today is a repetition of my history and the history of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And, you know, there was a Spanish translator, and so she was translating, but after I walked off the step, I said, wow, what did I just say? This is so, I mean, I wasn't consciously aware of it until that moment. And I was standing there, and the ACLU, it was a grassroots leadership camera guy. He was filming it. He walked over to me and he said, do you want to go to Crystal City now? And I said, yeah, I do. He said, okay, let's go. So we drove. It was like 48 miles, not very far. And he just had me talk as we found the place that was now just concrete slabs where the cottages had been, and just remnants. And it's a high school, an area where a high school is now. And I just got a kind of flood of, I was very young at that time. I was like 2.5. So I didn't have like concrete memories, but I definitely had a flood of emotion, thinking that these children that I had met at Carnes was me. But that nobody was protesting for us. Nobody was marching around signing petitions, writing to their congresspeople about what had happened to us. We had essentially been forgotten and ignored and hated by most of America, that essentially turned their back on us. So it became a much bigger issue. It was, and you know, over time, realizing that this wasn't just a Japanese American issue. This is an American issue. This is a repetition of using mass incarceration as a way of oppressing people of color. And the traumatic psychological damage and harm as a result of that, spreads through all of U.S. history.
A younger generation of Japanese Americans are rejecting the racist, politically conservative model minority stereotype. Instead, they are embracing the narratives of resistance and protest, stories that have always been there, especially at Tule Lake, but that were marginalized and ignored in a Japanese American narrative that celebrated military service, collaboration, and obedience.
So we had held this workshop for Japanese American community organizers, social justice advocates at the Tule Lake Pilgrimage. And, it has this overwhelming response, and we can't fit everyone in the room, and people are very inspired. They decide we will form what's called this Japanese American Action Network that really becomes sort of a precursor organization to Sudo for Solidarity. It's a loose network of groups all across the country that were already doing organizing work, but also have an interest at that point in stopping the policies and the cruelties of the Trump administration. So that happens. And then the very next day, we're holding a protest as part of the National Families Belong Together Day of Action. And we decided, since we were going to be out at the actual segregation site for our ceremonies, and program as part of the 2018 Tule Lake Pilgrimage, that we would go ahead and at the end of the program stage a demonstration. And there was just there was a deep sense of passion and solidarity. People were angry. This is a community that has always understood and embraced resistance. But if you remember in that moment, they were taking children, in some cases infants, and they were imprisoning them separately from their parents. And there was just incredible atrocities and cruelties that were going on. And it was hard to believe, you couldn't fathom that they would be doing this, and yet they were getting away with it. And so there was this incredible sense of determination that we would speak out. And the Tule Lake community, understands resistance and speaking out. So we held a demonstration, and it took place right outside the stockade, the jail inside of Tule Lake. And so I remember seeing pictures afterwards of the crowd at the protest, and Castle Rock is in the background, and we're right in front of the jail. And the power of that moment of this community in the place where they were so targeted by state violence, where people were literally dragged across the grass and beaten, standing there together, demanding an end to family and child detention. And people brought signs, and the whole first row were survivors, and many of them were in their 90s.
It's been over 75 years since the World War II incarceration, yet Tule Lake remains the darkest and the least appreciated chapter of the Japanese American World War II incarceration. Few Japanese Americans know that over 10% of the incarcerated population resisted and protested against the injustice. The vehicle of that mass protest was an ill-conceived, incompetently administered government loyalty questionnaire. Over 12,000 protesters refused to cooperate with this loyalty questionnaire and were punished with segregation to Tule Lake. In fall 1943, Tule Lake became a maximum security segregation center, a place filled with the no-nos and dissidents who questioned their futures in a racist America. The segregation centers white administrators treated community organizing for self-governance as troublemaking. Community advocacy to improve living conditions, safety, and security in the concentration camps was treated as evidence of being pro-Japan and disloyal. Japanese American demands for justice and civil rights were criminalized as anti-American. The government sought to denationalize and deport many of these protesters, deeming them as disloyal for the act of peacefully protesting their mistreatment. For most of the past 75 years, government abuses at Tule Lake have gone unquestioned. The stories of Tule Lake's activists ignored, and survivors shamed and silenced. Perversely, it's taken decades for our own community to recognize that the protesters at Tule Lake are the long missing story of Japanese American civil rights resistance during the incarceration. The loyal-disloyal paradigm the government imposed on Japanese Americans divided our community, creating false images of super patriotic, loyal Americans versus disloyal troublemakers.
The government effort of splitting and fracturing our community actually started with the executive order. There was no proof. In fact, there was research and information provided that said that the Japanese Americans were not a risk to national security, and yet the president signed the executive order that incarcerated us. And that kind of manipulation so that the president would be viewed as protecting the country after an attack where America was completely unprepared for the attack, to divert attention to, who was responsible. They scapegoated Japanese Americans. And so it started right from the beginning. And of course, discrimination and racism towards Asian Americans had been going on for decades.
It's taken nearly 7 decades for our traumatized community to recognize righteous protest in the concentration camps, to recognize and celebrate our own civil rights heroes who resisted injustice. Considering Hiroshi Kashiwagi's life and the segments from Emiko Omori's iconic 1999 film, Rabbit in the Moon, we see that the stories of protest have been around for decades. However, these are stories our community ignored, failing to recognize their significance. We know now that Japanese Americans protested in large numbers and wound up segregated at Tule Lake, where thousands of angry and audacious people showed great moral and political courage, protesting the government's abuse of power. And for most of their lives, our civil rights heroes went unacknowledged, even scorned within our own community, paying a very high price for their courage. Thanks to the work of the Tule Lake Committee, working with the state of California and the National Park Service, in 2006, the Tule Lake Segregation Center was designated a National Historic Landmark. Landmark status is the highest honor given to a historic property and establishes the Tule Lake site among America's treasures. In December 2008, Tule Lake was brought into the national park system as a unit of a larger national monument. And in 2019, through an act of Congress, Tule Lake became the Tule Lake National Monument. Of the 10 War Relocation Authority concentration camps, Tule Lake was unique as the only one to become a maximum security segregation center. It was notoriously used to punish Japanese Americans who refused to give unqualified yes answers to the misguided, incompetently administered loyalty questionnaire. During segregation, Tule Lake became the biggest concentration camp, with 18,700 inmates crowded into a facility built for 15,000. Tule Lake was the most heavily militarized of the 10 concentration camps, with 5 incarceration sites within the camp used to punish dissidents. Tule Lake was the only concentration camp to have its own isolation center, a special War Relocation Authority prison that evaded due process and punished several hundred loyalty questionnaire resistors at Tule Lake. Tule Lake had the notorious bullpen, a primitive tent stockade. It had 2 other more permanent stockades, Area B stockade that detained over 200 inmates during and after martial law, and the Area 99 stockade adjacent to the infamous jail that was used to detain American citizens whom the government planned to deport to Japan. Tule Lake was the only concentration camp to have its own jail that was completed in February 1945, imprisoning Japanese Americans who had been manipulated into giving up their United States citizenship. Thanks to a sympathetic segregation center photographer, Robert Ross, we have rare photos of the jail's lay-down strikers being dragged to the train taking them to the Department of Justice internment camps. These men, American citizens, renounced their U.S. citizenship under duress, becoming enemy aliens who could be legally deported. At Tule Lake, 5,461 Nisei and Kibei renounced their U.S. citizenship. In contrast, at the other 9 WRA camps, only 128 persons renounced. The renunciation program at Tule Lake was the darkest moment in the Japanese American incarceration story, yet it has received little scrutiny. Tule Lake was the first War Relocation Authority camp to open on May 27, 1942, and it was the last to close on March 20th, 1946. Approximately 400 Japanese Americans remaining at Tule Lake were sent to the Crystal City Family Internment Camp in Texas, where the government prepared to deport them.
Those who were married and whose families were dependent upon them for support presented a special problem. This was resolved by establishing a family facility at Crystal City, Texas, 110 miles southwest of San Antonio. It was important, of course, that normal living conditions prevail, and to that end, those detained were expected to do most of the work in connection with the operation of the facility.
For most of the post-war years, Tule Lake civil rights protesters vanished from the Japanese American incarceration narrative, stigmatized and erased by community silence. The government prepared to use Tule Lake again in the 1950s as a concentration camp for communists. And in the 1960s, Tule Lake was again proposed for use as a concentration camp for Black civil rights activists. The Bureau of Reclamation contributed to the erasure of Tule Lake's history, giving concentration camp lands and barracks to white homesteaders and creating a white landscape in the Tule Lake Basin. This self-proclaimed, quote, white man's country, unquote, did not welcome Japanese Americans or other Asian Americans, and also excluded Native Americans and Black Americans. The predecessor agency to the Federal Aviation Administration helped pave over and erase evidence of the concentration camp. Homesteaders bulldozed the concentration camp cemetery, using the dirt where corpses were buried to fill the concentration camp's grid of ditches. And they paved over the site, where thousands of Japanese American lives were destroyed, and where 331 men, women, and children died. Today, this airfield for crop dusters occupies 2/3 of the concentration camp lands. For decades, the Tule Lake Committee has worked to ensure the story of segregation would not be forgotten. In recent years, we are energized by a new generation of Nikkei activists who have been inspired by the audacity of Tule Lake's dissidents. Young activists and organizers who recognize our community's moral authority and our responsibility to challenge similar injustices.